session named Hope on the Pathway to Net Zero for Buildings, which we hope we will also generate hope within all of you by the end of this session, how buildings can contribute towards better planet for people and nature. So just to read the room to begin with, I would like to ask, how many of you have been engaged with the world of buildings in one or another way? If you are also a big fan of architecture, that counts too. Okay, 2, 3, okay. We have some people who are into buildings already. How many of you have heard about the impact that the buildings have on the climate change and know about? Okay, great. So we all know that, well, the global floor area is going to increase by 15% in the coming 5 years. And we are going to build an equivalent of Paris every week until 2050. And the buildings add up to the 40% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. That has a crucial impact on the way we're going to make sure that we align with Paris Agreement and drive the action in the right direction. So that's why buildings are so important. And in cities like Tokyo, New York, Paris, buildings account for the 70% of their emissions. That's why we're here today to discuss what kind of solutions exist to make sure that buildings are built in a way that are serving us rather than are working against the planet. Another reality is that the impact of the buildings is often unseen. The sector is usually very fragmented, and usually it's also very resistant to change. So within that reality, we really felt it's important to bring the hope and the solutions. And I couldn't have any better speakers today with me who have worked on a lot of projects who are actually bringing that hope and the positive change into the built environment. So I will go forward with introducing them, and then we'll move into the discussion. So today with me I have Victoria Barros, who is responsible for strategic partnerships and insight at Compass VC, an early stage venture capital firm backing breakthrough innovation in the built environment. Previously, as director of World Green Building Council, Victoria led a pioneering global program to accelerate total decarbonization of the sector by 2050. And she also has co-authored a book, A Whole System Approach to High Performance Buildings. Also, I have with me today Paul King, who is the CEO of Built by Nature. Acronyms, it's very rampant in the built field. A not-for-profit whose mission and vision is a built environment that works in unison with nature. Previously, Paul was a managing director of sustainability and social impact at Lend-Lease Europe. He was the founding CEO of the UK Green Building Council and worked for the World Wildlife Foundation as the campaigns director. They both have done much more, but these are just some of the highlights of their great work. And to move forward to dive into it, I would like to first ask you what personally excites you about buildings, and how did you end up in this field of the built environment?
Sure. Well, thank you, Nazakat, and thank you to you all for joining us today. I really believe that this is such an important topic, and it's great to see it getting a lot more attention at spaces like COP, so thank you for joining us. So my journey, I think, technically professionally started at architecture school, but I think it starts way, way before that. My dad always worked in construction, so I was spending time on construction sites in the summer that probably isn't allowed to happen now. And you know, we've been renovating houses ever since I was very young. So the idea that you can, you know, adapt and change your house around you has been something that I've literally lived in my entire life. And you know, I can just remember being in buildings as a very young age. A lot of my memories from being younger and traveling are, you know, on holidays are remembering the spaces that we were in. So you're right, you know, everyone interacts with the built environment and doesn't necessarily appreciate the effect that it's having on our planet. And I went to architecture school. I actually studied at college as part of an art program. I started looking into buildings, and that led me into architecture. And my architecture degree had an environmental design component, just 1 hour a week, and that's essentially what I built my entire career off of. I've worked in consulting, like advising on building projects and existing buildings on how to improve their performance, so reduce their energy consumption, and then I really had the sense that as a sector we were happy with buildings that were a bit better or a bit more green, a bit less bad. And then around about the Paris Agreement, the time of the Paris Agreement being signed, the World Green Building Council had launched Advancing Net Zero, which is the program that you mentioned to take the sector to full decarbonisation. And that for me was a real opportunity to make some great strides in the way that the sector is accountable for its impacts, which are absolutely enormous. And I think we've made some really great progress. Like here at COP, we're talking about a buildings breakthrough, which is a big initiative that is government-led and is bringing governments together with big commitments on implementing, finally, policies to take some action on some of these big impact areas. And that's something that just wasn't on the cards a few years ago. So it is painfully slow, but what excites me is seeing the front runners within industry taking the opportunity to demonstrate what's possible on case studies, on projects, on policies that we're starting to see come through at a city level, for example, and even the sorts of solutions and technologies that we get to invest in that helps give me confidence and optimism that we can start moving the needle. We just need to be getting there a bit faster.
Great, that's something that we're going to dive
Exactly.
into in our conversation, and I'm really excited to hear about more details about those. But Paul, I will turn to you now. Please, can you also tell us what brought you to this field?
Thank you, Nezakat. And again, thank you all for coming. And it's good to be here. So I guess how did I find my way into this? My first love really was nature. As a small boy growing up in just north of London in the UK, I was passionate about wildlife and nature, and my kind of dream job when I grew up was to go and work for WWF, then the World Wildlife Fund. And I was lucky enough to go and work for WWF for about 13 years. And one of the things that WWF started doing in the late 1990s and has been doing ever since is producing a thing called the Living Planet Report, which has two main indicators. One, looking at the kind of health of global wildlife species on the planet, and the other one looking at our human ecological footprint, the impact that we have on the planet. And I remember in the late 1990s reading this report and realizing not only were we seeing global wildlife species declining by about 2/3 since I was born, but we also saw our ecological footprint, our human impact, increasing exponentially in the opposite direction. And in 2001, I was invited to go and visit a housing project that WWF had given a little grant to in South London that was basically conceived around the idea of creating housing for people that enabled them to live within their fair share of the Earth's resources, right? So to lead a one planet lifestyle. On average, if everybody lived the same way as most people do in the UK, we'd need 3 planets to support us. And the idea here was, how could you create the conditions for people to live within the carrying capacity of one planet, that is of course the one that we have. And that really inspired me, and on the back of that I launched a campaign for WWF called 1 Million Sustainable Homes, and I guess I've been working in sustainable housing and building almost for 25 years ever since then. And I think, fundamentally the thing for me is that it is, after all, our human habitat, right? We have this bizarre notion that somehow we can carry on our lives sort of disconnected from the natural world and planetary limits. That's what's got us into these problems, whether it's biodiversity loss or climate change or some of the other crises that we face. And it's that disconnection. And I think we need to think about our human habitat. It's no surprise really that the built environment is such a big contributor to carbon emissions, because it's where we spend most of our time, right? Living, working, playing, learning, getting well in hospitals and what have you. It's where we spend our time. So what we need to do is to create a built environment that exists in harmony with nature, just like all the other species managed to do.
Amazing. So interesting to hear also this personal background to the work that you've been doing. I myself also have grown up in this city, in Baku, that has changed really tremendously since my childhood. And actually I came to realize the role and impact of built environment in our lives quite later in my life, and then I started backtracking and thinking about different moments in life or the periods of the development where I thought, wow, built environment is shaping so much of what we do, how we live, how we interact with each other. So it is a crucial field and sector, and we're all very passionate about it, but we also want to have hope for the ways that it is not working, that it's possible to change it and make it more positive in terms of contribution it has. I'm a strong believer that hope needs to have a plan and action behind, otherwise it can remain a bit abstract. So in order to bring that plan and action forward, I would like to ask each of you to talk about a project or a couple of projects and initiatives that personally bring you hope. And it would be great to also talk about the enabling conditions that have allowed the success behind this project.
Sure. So I'll talk about something that I heard about very recently at Climate Week New York, which has gotten me very excited and gives me hope for the fact that we can finally start making a dent in some of these emissions. You touched on it earlier, Nazakat. The sector is very fragmented. It doesn't love change. In a previous job, I've worked on construction sites trying to make them paperless. It's very hard to do. You know, even some very basic things like that. You know, we're asking the sector to completely change the way that we're building, the materials we're using, how we create those materials, how we transport them, how we use our buildings. And it's not easy. And in fact, of course, we spend so much time in buildings that it's also really disruptive to go in and intervene. It can be very intrusive to go into someone's home and audit, have a look at where you could make improvements, and the same goes for big commercial offices. So there has been, over the course of the many years we've been trying to achieve some progress in this space, lots of different initiatives to try and tackle this big issue. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we're starting to see some really exciting policy initiatives coming out, and that's what I'd like to share a bit about, which will absolutely act as a catalyst in a way that some of the voluntary initiatives perhaps haven't quite been able to achieve that traction. So in New York, cities are responsible for 73% of emissions, as you mentioned. Yeah, exactly. So on average in cities, it's about 40. New York, you can't not think about buildings, right? It's literally all buildings. So 73%. So in order for the city to have a net zero goal, it cannot not address the emissions from its buildings, and particularly its existing buildings. They're running out of space to build new buildings, which is why we see those very thin skyscrapers going up. So they've implemented in 2019 a policy called Local Law 97. Now this is at city law, so whatever happens at federal level, the cities still have a lot of power in terms of implementing policy. So hopefully it will ride the course of different governments. But the requirements are that for all buildings over 25,000 square feet, there is a carbon threshold, a limit of how much energy or how much carbon emissions those buildings can be responsible for, which is linked to how much energy it consumes and where that energy is coming from. And so, you know, knowing there's a lot of measures that can be made on energy efficiency and that we have a limit of how much carbon we can be causing, so there are these thresholds. If your buildings are responsible for more carbon than that, there's a fine of $267 a ton, which is a lot compared to the average carbon tax or internal carbon price that's usually set at about $100 a ton. So it's really getting the attention of the real estate owners of these buildings and the users about what that means. It's going to hit them in the pocket, right? And we're literally at that stage of needing the drastic measures, right? We're at that time. So the reporting period is coming to an end of the first cycle, and the fines are going to kick in next year. So it's very, very real. It's happening right now. And every 5 years, those thresholds will come down. The amount of those fines is therefore going to go up, and it's also going to affect more organizations. And the idea is that you should be incentivized to use that money and invest into the buildings, right, to improve the energy efficiency. In the meantime, the City of New York just announced at Climate Week that they will be using the money that's generated through offsets, which is that you can offset up to 10% of the emissions that you can't reduce. They're going to use that money, also set at $267 a ton, to create a fund to invest in the energy efficiency improvements of social housing that's not covered under Local Law 97. So suddenly an initiative that's a bit uncomfortable for massive real estate owners and tenants in New York that have been able to overconsume energy and be quite wasteful will actually be used through a mechanism to help people be able to heat their homes in the winter and keep cool in the summer and improve people's lives. So it's a drastic measure, but that's where we're at, and it can also create some social good as well.
Wow, that's such a great example. I mean, we hear a lot about cities leading the ambitions on changing the way the built environment works for better. And I think you touched upon such an important point, really stressing how, if we're talking about the transitioning the built environment, we cannot really decouple the environmental and the social.
Yep.
And these two really need to work together. And this is such an excellent example where a city has been leading on a very ambitious policy, but also having both sides really top of mind and top of agenda. So
and I think already other cities across the states are rolling out the same model. So hopefully it will really do some good.
yeah, these kind of pilots really have the potential to really trickle down to other cities and then hopefully be picked up by more regions and cities and countries.
Yeah, that's right.
Paul, I'll turn next to you. What is
Sure.
your example?
Well, I was spoilt for choice really here in terms of what to talk about, but I thought I might just talk a little bit about a project that I've kind of lived with and indeed lived in over the last, 10 years or so, I guess, which is a project in Elephant and Castle, which is right in the centre of London. It's just south of the river, but it's kind of geographically right in the centre of London if you look at a bird's eye view. The area was very, very badly bombed in the Second World War, and there was a lot of post-war construction, and there was a lot of sort of large-scale sort of Corbusian architecture, brutalist concrete architecture that went up in the late 60s and early 70s. And by the time it got to the 90s, some of it was just no longer fit for purpose. So the local council decided that an area that was previously occupied by a very large social housing estate would have to be demolished and needed to be regenerated. And it was a very controversial project, and I could talk about it for hours, but we haven't got hours. So I'll just touch on some of the key points. What was interesting was that at the very early stages, the developer, Lendlease, who I was working for at the time, decided to call this project Elephant Park. But it had been assumed that some of the trees that had grown up inside the old housing estate that was going to be demolished were going to be cut down. People hadn't really thought about this. They just had made this assumption that these trees were going to be cut down. And not surprisingly, some local people were pretty upset about that. And they came and they protested with placards saying, you're going to call this a new park and you're going to start by cutting down the trees. And we thought, these people have a point. And that was actually a great gift, because what it opened right from the very beginning was a dialogue with the local community on communities. It's a very, very diverse local community. Starting with a conversation about the trees and how these trees could be protected, but furthermore, how in fact the whole site could be redesigned. And what has happened as a result of that is a site which has pulled off quite a trick. It's densified this bit of the city, as I say, centre of City of London, so it's a very valuable site. It's effectively doubled the amount of homes, but has managed to create half of the total area of the site as completely publicly accessible public realm, including the largest new park in central London for over 75 years, and the most incredible green spaces. And every home, 3,500 homes, every home has access to an outside space, be it a balcony or a small garden, and shared access to the park and so on, right? So the connection of people to nature, again, is really key. The sustainability in the credentials of the development are very high. Having said that, the development committed to be net zero carbon back, probably 12 years ago now. And at that time, people were thinking more about operational carbon, the carbon resulting from the energy use in the development, not so much about the energy embodied in the materials that went into it. So although there were quite a number of buildings that were built with timber, for example, including a whole street of passive houses. For those of you not aware with that, it's one of the highest energy efficient ratings of new homes in the world. So these are super energy efficient homes built with timber, which also stores carbon. It could go further in terms of those materials. So it's been amazing to see how that project has evolved. Again, how it's involved local people and the input that they've had into the design of that has been really critical. And I now see projects, for example, there's one coming up called the Phoenix Project, which is being designed for East Sussex in the southeast of England, which has had, and again, it's an area that's had a troubled history. There's been lots of contentious planning proposals, but the proposal that's now got planning consent has been very proactive in involving local people in the design. It's going to very much lead with timber-based buildings and set new levels of sustainability and very, very high levels of affordability as well. There's a huge emphasis not just on affordable housing, but also on affordable and community food production, canteens for local people to be able to eat healthy food very affordably, and so on and so forth, which I think is so important. And I just maybe just want to put, because these days the hat I wear is built by nature, where we're about promoting the use of timber and other natural materials as a substitute for carbon-intensive concrete and steel. I just want to say a word about that because, you know, you said, Nazika, at the beginning, you know, the built environment accounts for about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Well, about 10%, a quarter of that, is the embodied carbon in materials, right? So this is an important part of the puzzle. And there is a lot of timber already available. Cambridge University did a study a couple of years ago where they showed that actually, if everybody in Europe, hypothetically, were to live in a 3-bedroomed mass timber apartment, an apartment completely constructed with timber, they said how much timber would be required for each apartment, and supposing everybody in Europe lived in one of these apartments, 750 million people, how much timber would be needed? And the answer was about a quarter of the annual harvest of sustainable wood coming out of European forests. Okay, so this is not an outrageous idea. In many parts of the world, there is enough resource available to, as I say, build low carbon housing and also to manage forests in a highly sustainable way.
Great. I really like that you brought up this point of the community engagement first, and that really linked well with the point that Victoria was making also in her example that was coming from the policy angle. And of course, like, spaces and buildings and places are primarily built for people. We need to also start accounting for nature in it, so that linkage is also really, really nice. But I feel like you have mentioned that since the project in London, this community engagement practices have proven to be really working well, and that has been happening across many other projects, I think, across many cities. And you have then moved on towards the timber as a solution for decreasing the whole life carbon emissions from the buildings and the footprint that the buildings have on the planet. If we are going to build the way we build now, there is no way that we're going to remain within the carbon budgets that we need to. So now I really like this mindset that we have set up in the session on the hope and the solutions and really driving forward what can bring change. But in our day-to-day life, we don't talk so much about solutions, to be honest. So I feel really happy and privileged to be in this space where we're focusing on the positive. But then the built environment person in me also wants to ask the questions, but what are the challenges and what are the gaps that are preventing us from scaling up those solutions? Why the policies that are there in New York that are really setting the caps and making sure that it links with the social equity goals within the built environment aren't really spreading at this pace that is needed? And then I will turn to Paul on the question about the timber.
Sure, yeah, I can take a stab at that. So I mentioned my journey up until World Green Building Council. I was there for 6.5 years leading that program, and the Advancing Net Zero program was all about trying to move the sector forward on that decarbonisation journey. And again, we're making some great progress, and with the Buildings Breakthrough and a lot more signals of political buy-in, not quite yet the full policy frameworks we need to see, and some fantastic commitments coming from the corporate sector. So there was a great consensus in general within the sector. Like, we know what the challenge is, we know that it's very impactful, it can even be harmful. We know what we need to do and when we need to do it by, but the answers lie in the how, right? In the solutions, and enabling access to solutions, tools, technologies, materials that solve all of the multitude of problems that the built environment has in a way that's cost effective and affordable and accessible. So I think we need to be helping the sector make those decisions on low carbon choices. So I've moved into venture capital, which is well, not so much brand new anymore, but I've been here for about a year. But it's a new space for me, and bringing that sort of experience from World Green Building Council of knowing what those barriers are, because if we don't have access to those solutions, then we simply won't be able to see those changes. You know, policy is great, but it can be a long time between an idea that could be interesting becoming policy, and then it doesn't give the investor community total confidence on what we should be investing in, because maybe that policy will disappear in a few years. And that has been the case, unfortunately. You know, as a sector, we've had big wins on electrification recently in buildings. We can make all buildings electric and very energy efficient and powered with renewable energy, and then we tackle the big problem of embodied carbon, as Paul said. Unfortunately, Vancouver passed a policy for that and has walked it back. So, you know, sometimes the policy mechanisms can't give us the confidence we need to invest in those solutions, but I am fortunate to be able to, through Compass VC, we invest in hardware and advanced materials and renovation solutions, all the way through to software that can help with that decision making and can help you understand, you know, what are the emissions from your entire portfolio, what are your pathways for decarbonisation, and how should you invest in them through a company called Optimal. And then we also have renovation solutions such as EcoWorks that comes from Berlin, which is a sort of second skin to existing buildings, so you can bring off-site manufactured new walls and roofs and literally crane in whole new units to improve the energy efficiency of buildings, which we've already mentioned is a huge issue. And then to the heavy industry side, you know, it's fantastic that there is such development in the use of timber within buildings. It's absolutely part of the journey for the sector. But of course, we will still need concrete. We can't build roads and infrastructure out of timber. So absolutely, we need to be optimizing the use of those lower carbon options where they are an option. And then we are working with some low carbon cement providers, such as Material Evolution from the UK. You know, we're helping them to scale up their production facilities. However, their production facility that's opening very soon will be the largest producer of green cement in the UK, but will still only provide 1% of just the UK's demand alone. So to your point on challenge, we have a huge issue. We will back the ideas that we think have massive potential to solve some of the industry's biggest challenges, and then we help them scale, and then they need to scale even more, and that comes from creating the demand from the sector and from policy and from de-risking those solutions, and from working with some follow-on investors like growth investors to help them with scaling up those solutions, because we need lots of different solutions for every single challenge that the sector faces in order to completely embed them into the decision making across the full sector. So whilst it's a massive challenge within the sector, it also presents a huge opportunity. And you know, you just have to spend some time with startup founders and entrepreneurs. You can't help but being inspired by their passion and the ideas that they've got.
These are such great points, and I think like with the speed and the pace that we need to move, we cannot rely only on one tool. So policy is a great tool to have, but there are many other tools and approaches that we need to utilize at their max capacity to make sure that we get where we need to be.
And we talk about the ambition loop sometimes, right? So, you know, you can have front runner developers and private sector players like Lendlease who will go out there and develop a project like the one in Elephant and Castle, way ahead of what's required within regulation in London. So they've made the choice to build much better than what you could get away with, frankly, building in London at the time. that creates such an important demand signal and a confidence signal to policymakers that, first of all, contractors are ready to do that, designers can know how to design them, and people will want to buy them. And you were very early with that project, so there's a lot more maturity with the market as people have a better understanding of what good looks like. And it's known as the ambition loop. We can't go from 0 to 1,000 miles an hour. We have to be doing those mutually reinforcing actions that create the confidence. If the policymakers see those projects, see the demand, they can set the long-term frameworks that give the investors confidence to invest in the solutions that the whole industry is going to need in a few years' time when the policy comes, and that's how we're going to get out of this mess.
That is a brilliant pathway that you're setting up. Paul, with the time that we have, I would like to also ask you, so you've talked about the role that the timber and the bio-based materials in general can play in really making sure that we are on the right track with decarbonizing the built environment. Why those solutions are not being taken up, and what are the key challenges and gaps there, and where do you also see them being addressed already, their movement?
Sure. Well, I think, as Victoria said, a couple of things. One is, one thing it's important to say is I'm not sitting here advocating that all buildings should be 100% made out of timber. The reality is the vast majority, if not all buildings, will be hybrids. What we need to do is to use all materials in the best possible way, right? So equally, we shouldn't be stuffing as much wood into a building as we possibly can, because we need to use the resource sparingly, right? So as somebody I know says, we need more buildings in wood and less wood in buildings. But the point is that we should be looking at all materials like for like and say what is the lowest carbon and the best solution to be used in the certain application. That's the first thing. I guess the second thing is that Victoria also said is that, and I've worked in the industry and know this kind of firsthand, it is very resistant to change. Even in a company that was as progressive as the one I worked in, and it really has been very progressive on sustainability for a long time, still there is a lot of inbuilt resistance to change. Because actually in the end, a lot of the margins are quite tight in terms of where cost and profits sit. And the more predictable, the better. People don't like changing the way they do things. And that's why you do need some policy nudges, frankly, to get everybody to look at things slightly differently. And therefore, one of the things we do need is regulation around embodied carbon. As I say, when in the UK, for example, we've had building regulations that look at the energy efficiency of buildings since the 1960s. As I say, a quarter of the emissions associated with buildings is in the materials. We have no regulation for that part at all. Mm-hmm. In countries like Denmark, where they are already regulating embodied carbon, the industry is being transformed in the way that people are using those different materials. So you need to shift create a level playing field, but shift the message so that the industry will look at that. But it is difficult, for one company or a handful of companies to do it on their own, because often, of course, these things are less cost effective at a small scale. The minute you make them a mainstream option, the economies of scale kick in, and it becomes more affordable for everybody, I guess. So I think that's where we are. We're at the point now where we're seeing, I saw a presentation last week, credible project called Arboretum, which is the largest timber office in Paris, in La Défense in Paris. It's 125,000 square meters of office, all built with timber. And the other thing that's really exciting about it is the amount of land that they've set aside for landscaping, and the fact for every office they've created terraces so that everybody has access to natural space as well as really high quality office space as well. So again, I come back to my theme of connecting us back to nature, which I think is at the heart of so much of this. But again, it shows this stuff is possible. I mentioned before the Phoenix development by Human Nature, developer there, 750 homes planned, all to be built with timber. So we're starting to see it, And you know, there's a big, really important aspect of seeing is believing here.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is, in too many places, people have just accepted what they've been given.
Yeah.
In many cases, there is a situation of undersupply. So people will buy or occupy the buildings that exist. They haven't realised that they could influence a different kind of building. And I think the more we're seeing, you know, the art of the possible, doing it differently, the more people will realise we can have a different kind of built environment.
Great. What I'm taking also from your message is that we really need to shift the incentives and remove the barriers in order to make sure that we're going in the right direction. Well, thanks a lot to both of you for such an insightful conversation that we managed to squeeze into 40 minutes. I didn't notice how the time passed. I hope it's the same for the audience and we could get you excited about the buildings. That's the mission of my life. No, but it's great to host you both for a conversation, and we'll be around for a chat afterwards. So please do come around.
Thank you. Thank you.